The streets of downtown Atlanta hummed with the familiar energy of a Friday night. Street lamps cast warm pools of light on the sidewalks where groups of friends laughed and chatted as they moved between popular hangout spots. The clock had just struck 11 p.m., and Officer Thomas Reed was starting what he thought would be just another routine patrol shift. Reed had been with the Atlanta Police Department for 15 years, and he knew these streets like the back of his hand. Every crack in the sidewalk, every flickering neon sign, and every regular face had become part of his nightly routine. He'd seen thousands of nights just like this one, or so he thought. As he drove his patrol car slowly down Peachtree Street, the radio crackled with routine updates. A noise complaint here, a minor fender bender there, nothing out of the ordinary. Reed sipped his coffee, still steaming from the all-night diner where the owners knew him by name and always saved him a fresh pot. The nightlife district was particularly busy tonight. Students from the nearby university were celebrating the end of final exams, and young professionals were unwinding after a long workweek. Music spilled out onto the street each time a door opened, creating a patchwork of different songs that blended with the city's natural rhythm. Reed noticed some new faces working security at the popular clubs. He made a mental note to introduce himself later. Building good relationships with local businesses and their staff had always been a crucial part of his approach to community policing. It was something he took pride in, this connection with the neighborhood he served. As he cruised past the Blue Room, one of the most popular spots in the district, something caught his attention. The usual orderly line of patrons waiting to enter had broken formation, and there was movement near the entrance that didn't feel right to his experienced eye. After 15 years on the force, Reed had developed an almost sixth sense for trouble brewing. He pulled his patrol car to the curb, keeping his eyes fixed on the growing commotion. The blue and red lights from his vehicle's light bar painted the scene in alternating colors, reflecting off the windows of nearby buildings and the faces of curious onlookers who had started to gather. Several empty bottles lay scattered on the ground, glinting in the street lights. Reed could see the club's security staff trying to manage a situation that was quickly escalating. A young woman in a blue dress was at the center of it all, her voice rising above the general noise of the street as she tried to explain something to the imposing bouncer who stood with his arms crossed. What happened next would change everything, not just for Reed, but for the entire Atlanta Police Department. As he stepped out of his patrol car, straightening his uniform and adjusting his body camera, he had no idea that he was about to make a decision that would send shockwaves through the city's law enforcement community and beyond. The warm Georgia night air carried the scent of nearby restaurants and the sweet smell of magnolia trees that lined the street. Reed took a deep breath, his hand instinctively resting on his belt as he approached the scene. In all his years of service, he'd learned that first impressions and split-second decisions could make all the difference in how a situation played out. Little did he know, this particular situation would put that wisdom to the ultimate test. As he drew closer to the commotion, the young woman turned to face him, and in her eyes, he saw something that made him pause, not fear or defiance, but a quiet confidence that seemed oddly out of place in this chaotic scene. The next few minutes would prove to be the most crucial of Reed's career, though he didn't know it yet. As he prepared to intervene, the street's ambient noise seemed to fade away, leaving only the sound of his boots on the pavement and his own steady breathing. Sometimes the biggest moments in life arrive disguised as ordinary ones, and this was about to become one of those moments. As Officer Reed approached the scene, he could see the situation more clearly. The young woman in the blue dress was trying to explain something to the bouncer, her hands moving expressively as she spoke. She wasn't swaying or showing any obvious signs of intoxication, but Reed had already made up his mind about what he was seeing. The bouncer, a tall man with broad shoulders who clearly took his job seriously, kept shaking his head. "I'm sorry, but I can't let you back in," he was saying, his voice firm but professional. Around them, a small crowd had gathered, some people pulling out their phones to record what was happening. The young woman's friend, who had been quietly standing nearby, stepped forward. "Listen, she's telling the truth. We were trying to help someone inside who wasn't feeling well, that's all." Her voice was steady, concerned, but the bouncer remained unmoved. The situation was drawing more attention now. Music from inside the Blue Room thumped in the background, creating an odd soundtrack to the tension building on the sidewalk. A couple of other patrons waiting in line were whispering to each other, their eyes darting between the officer and the unfolding scene. Reed's boots crunched on broken glass as he stepped closer. Empty bottles lay scattered around, though none of them belonged to the woman in blue. She turned to face him, her expression changing from frustration to relief at seeing a police officer arrive. "Officer, please," she began, "there's been a misunderstanding." But Reed cut her off. In his mind, he'd seen this scenario play out hundreds of times before, young people causing trouble after having too much to drink. He didn't notice how clear her eyes were or how steadily she stood. He didn't pay attention to the way her friend was trying to explain the situation calmly and rationally. The growing crowd of onlookers shifted uncomfortably as Reed's turn grew more confrontational. A street musician who had been playing nearby stopped his guitar mid-song, sensing the change in atmosphere. The warm Georgia night suddenly felt a few degrees colder. "I've seen enough," Reed declared, his voice carrying an edge that made several bystanders exchange worried glances. He reached down and picked up one of the empty bottles from the ground, a decision that would soon prove to be the biggest mistake of his career. The young woman's friend stepped forward again, trying to defuse the situation. "Officer, please just listen for a moment. We can explain everything." But Reed had already committed to his course of action, his judgment clouded by years of dealing with similar-looking but very different situations. Time seemed to slow down as Reed raised the bottle. Later, when people would replay the videos they recorded on their phones, they would notice how the streetlights caught the glass, how the crowd collectively held its breath, and how the young woman's expression shifted from confusion to disbelief. What happened next would be replayed on news channels across the country. The woman's words, spoken clearly and calmly despite the situation, would echo through police precincts and courtrooms. But in that moment, standing on that sidewalk in downtown Atlanta, nobody could have predicted the chain of events that was about to unfold. The bouncer, who had been firm but professional throughout the encounter, took a step back. Even he could sense that something wasn't right about the officer's approach. The night air grew thick with tension as more phones came out to record what was happening. A passing cab slowed down, its passengers pressing their faces against the windows. The driver, a longtime veteran of Atlanta's nightlife scene, would later tell reporters he'd never seen anything quite like it. The blue and red lights from Reed's patrol car continued to paint the scene in alternating colors, creating an almost surreal atmosphere. The young woman stood her ground, her dignity intact despite the escalating situation. She wasn't what Reed had assumed she was, not even close. And in just a few seconds, he would learn exactly how wrong his assumptions had been. The truth about her identity was about to change everything, but for now, time hung suspended in that moment before revelation, before consequences, before the world would learn what happened when an officer made the wrong choice on what should have been an ordinary Friday night in Atlanta. The moment Officer Reed raised the empty bottle, time seemed to stand still on that Atlanta street. The crowd watched in stunned silence as he stepped toward the young woman, his face set with misplaced certainty. The neon signs from nearby businesses cast an eerie glow over the scene, their buzzing suddenly the loudest sound on the street. "Let's see how you like this," Reed said, his voice carrying an edge that made even veteran clubgoers wince. He held the bottle up, attempting to prove his point about what he wrongly assumed was public intoxication. The young woman stepped back, her eyes wide with disbelief rather than fear. Several phones recorded the scene from different angles, their small red lights blinking like electronic witnesses. A group of college students who had been waiting in line forgot about their plans to enter the club, transfixed by what was unfolding before them. The bouncer shifted his weight uncomfortably, clearly torn between his duty to the club and his instinct to intervene. The woman's friend called out, "Stop, you can't do this." Her voice cracked with a mix of panic and outrage. But Reed seemed to have tunnel vision, focused solely on what he believed was another routine case of a troublemaker who needed to be taught a lesson. As he moved closer with the bottle, the young woman remained surprisingly composed. She straightened her blue dress and lifted her chin, a gesture that would later be described by witnesses as showing remarkable dignity under pressure. The streetlights caught the subtle trembling of her hands, but her voice remained steady. "Officer," she said clearly, each word carefully chosen, "I need you to stop and think about what you're doing." The statement carried a weight that Reed didn't yet understand. Behind her, several bystanders had moved closer, their faces showing a mix of concern and outrage. Reed's response was to push forward, attempting to force the bottle toward her mouth in what he later claimed was an attempt to demonstrate a supposed intoxication. The crowd gasped collectively, the sound echoing off the brick buildings that lined the street. That's when she spoke the words that would change everything. "My father is Judge Wilson of the state Supreme Court." The effect was immediate. Reed's hand froze mid-motion, the bottle suddenly feeling like it weighed 1,000 pounds. The name Wilson rang through the air like a bell, causing several onlookers to exchange knowing looks. Anyone familiar with the Georgia legal system knew that name. The bottle slipped from Reed's fingers, hitting the concrete with a sharp crack that seemed to break the spell that had fallen over the scene. The sound of shattering glass was like a starting gun, setting everything in motion again. People who had been holding their breath suddenly started talking all at once. "Did she say Judge Wilson? Someone called the station. I got it all on video." Reed's face, which had been flushed with authority just moments before, now drained of color. His hand dropped to his side as the full implications of what he'd just done began to sink in. The young woman stood before him, no longer just another face in the crowd, but someone whose identity carried the weight of the entire state legal system. The bouncer, who had witnessed everything, stepped forward. "Officer," he said carefully, "I think we all need to take a step back." His voice was measured, professional, trying to salvage what was quickly becoming a career-ending situation for the police officer. In the distance, sirens could be heard approaching. Someone, probably one of the more quick-thinking bystanders, had called for backup. The blue and red lights from Reed's patrol car continued their rhythmic dance across the scene, now joined by the light from dozens of phone screens as people rushed to share what they'd witnessed. The young woman's friend had pulled out her own phone and was already making a call. "Yes, I'm with your daughter," she said into the device, her voice carrying clearly in the now quiet street. "You need to know what just happened." Reed took a stumbling step backward, his boot crunching on the glass from the bottle he dropped. The sound seemed to echo his crumbling career, 15 years of service suddenly in jeopardy because of one monumentally poor decision. The weight of his badge, usually a source of pride, now felt like it was pulling him down into the pavement. More patrol cars were arriving now, their sirens cutting through the night air. Officers who had worked with Reed for years would soon be securing the scene, taking statements, and trying to understand how their colleague had made such a serious error in judgment. The videos were already spreading across social media, and within hours, this corner of Atlanta would become the center of a story that would spark national conversations about police conduct and accountability. The name Judge Wilson echoed through Officer Reed's mind like a thunderclap. Every police officer in Georgia knew that name, the Chief Justice of the state Supreme Court, a man known for his unwavering stance on police accountability and ethical conduct. Now, standing on that downtown Atlanta sidewalk, Reed realized he had just tried to force a bottle into the mouth of this powerful judge's daughter. More patrol cars arrived at the scene, their lights painting the gathering crowd in alternating shades of blue and red. The other officers emerged from their vehicles cautiously, reading the tension in the air. They found their colleague, Officer Reed, standing frozen in place, his face a mask of dawning horror. "I need all officers to turn on their body cameras immediately," called out Lieutenant Chen, who had just arrived. She was a veteran officer known for her level head in crisis situations. She quickly took charge of the scene, directing officers to secure the perimeter and begin taking witness statements. Inside the Blue Room, curious patrons pressed against the windows, phones recording everything. The music that had been pounding through the walls moments ago had been turned down, as if the club itself was holding its breath. The bouncer was already giving his statement to an officer, gesturing to the scattered glass on the ground. Judge Wilson's daughter stood tall, her phone now in her hand as she spoke quietly but firmly to someone on the other end. "Yes, Dad, I'm okay. But you need to know what happened here." Her friend stood protectively nearby, still recording everything with her own phone. The videos were already spreading across social media like wildfire. Local news vans began arriving, their satellite dishes extending skyward as reporters rushed to set up their equipment. One of them recognized the young woman. She had covered several of Judge Wilson's high-profile cases. "This is a disaster," muttered one of the senior officers to Lieutenant Chen. Judge Wilson practically wrote the book on police conduct reform. He's been pushing for stricter accountability measures for years. Reed had finally moved, slumping against his patrol car. His hand shook as he removed his badge, placing it on the hood of the vehicle. 15 years of service, countless commendations, all potentially destroyed in a single moment of poor judgment. He could already imagine the headlines, the investigations, the disciplinary hearings. The crowd had grown larger, with people from nearby bars and restaurants gathering to watch the scene unfold. Someone in the crowd called out, "That's what happens when you abuse your power." The comment rippled through the onlookers, drawing murmurs of agreement. Lieutenant Chen approached Judge Wilson's daughter, her manner professional but apologetic. "Ms. Wilson, we'll need your official statement. Would you prefer to do this here or at the station?" She was already thinking about damage control, knowing this incident would have far-reaching consequences for the entire department. More police officials were arriving now, captains, internal affairs officers, even the public relations spokesperson. Word traveled fast when it involved someone of Judge Wilson's stature. The night air buzzed with urgent phone calls and radio communications as the department's higher-ups were notified one by one. The young woman's friend was sharing the video with other officers, the footage crystal clear despite the nighttime setting. On the small screen, Reed's actions played out in damning detail. Several officers winced as they watched, knowing this would become a textbook example of what not to do in their future training sessions. "The commissioner is on his way," announced one of the captains, his voice tight with concern. "And Judge Wilson's office just called. He's coming too." This news sent another wave of tension through the assembled officers. The judge was known for his fierce protection of civil rights and his unwavering demand for police accountability. Reed overheard this and seemed to shrink further into himself. He had worked so hard to build his career, to be one of the good cops who helped maintain order while respecting citizens' rights. Now, in one thoughtless moment, he had become exactly the kind of officer he had always criticized. Local residents who lived in nearby apartments had come out onto their balconies to watch the scene below. Some were live streaming the aftermath, adding their own commentary to the unfolding drama. The incident was quickly becoming more than just a local police matter. It was turning into a symbol of the ongoing national conversation about police conduct and accountability. The young woman remained remarkably composed, speaking calmly with the officers taking her statement. Her dignity in the face of what had happened made Reed's actions look even worse by comparison. She wasn't acting like someone seeking revenge. Rather, she carried herself like someone who understood the gravity of the moment and the change it could bring about. As midnight approached, the scene had transformed into something resembling a command center. Evidence markers dotted the ground where the bottle had shattered. Photographers from the department's forensic unit were documenting everything. What had started as a simple misunderstanding outside a nightclub had evolved into an incident that would have repercussions throughout the entire Georgia law enforcement community. By sunrise the next morning, the video had gone viral. News vans lined the street outside the Atlanta Police Department headquarters, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like maple trees. Inside, the chief of police hadn't slept, his coffee going cold as he watched the footage for what felt like the 100th time. The young woman's story spread quickly across social media and news channels. She hadn't been drunk at all. She had been trying to help another patron who had fallen ill inside the club. The bouncers' misunderstanding had escalated into something none of them could have predicted. Local morning shows played the clip on repeat, each replay making Officer Reed's actions look worse. "This is Channel 5 News, reporting live from downtown Atlanta," a reporter announced, her microphone catching the early morning traffic noise. Last night's incident involving Officer Reed and the daughter of State Supreme Court Judge Wilson has sparked widespread calls for police reform. The video, which has now been viewed millions of times, shows. Inside the Internal Affairs office, investigators worked through the night, pulling Reed's service record. His personnel file lay open on a desk, 15 years of service spread out in manila folders. They found other complaints buried in the paperwork, nothing this serious, but enough to paint a pattern that nobody had noticed before. The police commissioner called an emergency meeting at 7 a.m. Department heads filed into the conference room, their faces grim. On the wall-mounted TV, cable news channels were already running special segments about police conduct and accountability. The department's public relations team sat huddled in one corner, phones buzzing constantly with media requests. "The judge's daughter is willing to speak to the press," one officer reported, reading from his phone. "But she's being remarkably measured about it. She says she wants this to lead to positive change, not just punishment." The young woman's composure throughout the ordeal impressed everyone who watched her statement. Standing before a row of microphones later that morning, she spoke clearly and with purpose. "This isn't about revenge," she told the assembled reporters. "This is about making sure our police officers are properly trained and held accountable for their actions." Her father, Judge Wilson, made his own statement from the courthouse steps. The respected judge, known for his firm but fair rulings, showed the same composure as his daughter. "As a judge, I must recuse myself from any official proceedings related to this case. But as a father and a citizen, I am deeply concerned about what this incident reveals about our law enforcement culture." Back at the police station, Officer Reed sat in a small room with his union representative and a lawyer. The weight of his actions showed on his face. He hadn't slept, his uniform was wrinkled, and his eyes were red. "I don't know what I was thinking," he kept saying, his voice barely above a whisper. "I just assumed." Throughout the day, more details emerged. Security footage from inside the club confirmed the young woman's story about helping an ill patron. Witnesses came forward with their own videos and accounts. Each new piece of evidence painted a clearer picture of how badly Reed had misread the situation. The incident sparked a broader conversation within the department. Officers gathered in break rooms, watching the news coverage and discussing their own experiences. "It could have been any of us," one veteran officer admitted. "How many times have we made assumptions without getting the full story?" The police academy director called an emergency meeting with training staff. "We need to completely revise our approach," she insisted, spreading out the current training materials on her desk. "This incident shows gaps in our program that need to be addressed immediately." Community leaders began organizing town hall meetings to discuss police-community relations. Local church groups, civil rights organizations, and neighborhood associations all wanted to be part of the conversation. The incident had touched a nerve, bringing long-simmering concerns to the surface. The young woman's friend, who had recorded one of the clearest videos of the incident, spoke to investigators about what she had witnessed. "What struck me most was how quickly he jumped to conclusions," she explained. "There was no attempt to listen, to understand what was really happening. It was like he saw what he expected to see, not what was actually there." By evening, national news organizations had picked up the story. Political commentators debated police reform on primetime shows. Social media buzzed with hashtags calling for change. What had started as one officer's terrible mistake was grown into something much larger, a catalyst for examining how law enforcement interacts with the communities they serve. The young woman spent the day meeting with various community organizations and advocacy groups. Rather than letting anger drive her actions, she channeled her experience into something constructive. "We have an opportunity here," she told a community meeting. "We can use this incident to create real, lasting change in how our police department operates." The internal affairs investigation moved forward with unprecedented speed. Inside a conference room at police headquarters, investigators pored over Officer Reed's entire career history. Boxes of files covered the long table, each containing reports, evaluations, and civilian complaints from his 15 years on the force. "Look at this one from 3 years ago," said Detective Chen, holding up a report. "A complaint about aggressive behavior during a traffic stop. It was dismissed, but the pattern is there." She added another sticky note to the growing collection on the wall, where they were mapping out a timeline of concerning incidents. The investigation team had been working around the clock, fueled by coffee and the knowledge that the entire city was watching. They interviewed other officers who had worked with Reed, dispatch operators who had handled his calls, and civilians who had filed previous complaints. Down the hall, tech specialists analyzed footage from Reed's body camera and patrol car dashboard camera. The young woman's encounter wasn't the only incident they found. There were other moments of confrontation, other instances where Reed's judgment seemed questionable. None had escalated to this level, but together they painted a troubling picture. "His supervisors should have caught this," muttered the lead investigator, reviewing annual performance evaluations. There were warning signs, small things, but they were there. He highlighted another passage in a years-old report that mentioned Reed's aggressive approach to civilian interactions. The investigation spread beyond Reed himself. The department's training programs came under scrutiny. How had someone with these tendencies continued to serve without intervention? The training division chief sat through hours of meetings, defending their programs while acknowledging the need for change. In the break room, officers discussed the case in hushed tones. "I worked with Reed on the night shift last summer," one officer recalled. "He always had a way of escalating situations that didn't need to be escalated. But none of us said anything. We should have." The police union representatives struggled to balance their duty to protect their member with the overwhelming evidence against him. During one tense meeting, a union rep sighed heavily. "We have to think about the bigger picture here. This case could change everything about how we handle problem officers." Community members came forward with their own stories. A local church pastor shared security camera footage from 6 months earlier, showing Reed being unnecessarily confrontational with teenagers in the church parking lot. "We didn't file a complaint then," the pastor explained. "Maybe we should have." The investigation team set up a hotline for the public to share information. Tips flooded in, some helpful, some not. Each one had to be verified, documented, and added to the growing case file. The team worked methodically, knowing their findings would face intense scrutiny. In the evidence room, technicians carefully preserved the shattered bottle from the incident, photographing each piece. They analyzed security footage from nearby businesses, building a minute-by-minute timeline of that night. Every detail mattered. This case would likely become a landmark in police accountability. The young woman's statement was particularly powerful. She sat in an interview room with investigators, her voice steady as she recounted the events. "I want you to understand something," she told them. "This isn't just about that night. It's about every person who's ever faced this kind of treatment and didn't have the power to speak up." Her father, Judge Wilson, kept his distance from the investigation, understanding the importance of avoiding any appearance of influence. But his presence was felt throughout the process. Everyone involved knew that his reputation for fairness and accountability would demand nothing less than a thorough investigation. Reed himself cooperated with investigators, seeming to understand the gravity of his actions. In his formal statement, his voice shook as he tried to explain his behavior. "I got caught up in assumptions," he admitted. "I saw what I expected to see, not what was actually happening. I've done this job for so long, I thought I knew everything. I was wrong." The investigation expanded to include interviews with the bouncer and staff from the Blue Room. Their accounts revealed crucial details about the moments leading up to the confrontation. The club's security cameras had captured everything, providing valuable context that supported the young woman's version of events. As weeks passed, the investigation team assembled their findings into a comprehensive report. They included recommendations for department-wide changes, enhanced training programs, better supervision of officers, and new procedures for handling civilian complaints. This case would become more than just one officer's mistake. It would be a catalyst for systemic change. The final report ran hundreds of pages, documenting not just the incident itself, but the cultural and institutional factors that had allowed it to happen. It would become required reading at the police academy, a case study in how quickly poor judgment could destroy careers and erode public trust. 3 months after that fateful night outside the Blue Room, the Atlanta Police Department looked very different. The incident that had started with an empty bottle and a terrible mistake had sparked changes that nobody could have predicted. In a brightly lit conference room at police headquarters, the chief of police stood before a group of reporters. "Today, we're announcing comprehensive reforms in our department," he declared, his voice firm. "What happened that night showed us we needed to do better, and we're committed to making those changes." The young woman who had faced Officer Reed that night sat in the front row, listening intently. She had become an unexpected catalyst for change, turning a traumatic experience into something positive. Her nonprofit organization, focused on police reform and community relations, was already making waves across the state. "We're not just changing policies," she told reporters after the conference. "We're changing the whole conversation about how police and communities interact." Her words carried weight now, She had earned respect not just because of who her father was, but because of how she had handled the entire situation. The police academy looked different too. New training modules focused on de-escalation and bias recognition. Veteran officers sat alongside recruits, everyone learning together. On the wall hung a framed photo from that night, a reminder of how quickly things could go wrong when assumptions took over. "See this?" an instructor would say, pointing to the image. "This is what happens when we forget that our job is to serve and protect, not to judge and punish." The lesson wasn't lost on anyone. The incident had become a powerful teaching tool, showing future officers the importance of patience and proper judgment. Former Officer Reed's story had its own impact. After his termination and the criminal charges, he made an unexpected decision. Instead of fighting the charges, he began speaking to police departments about his experience. "I lost everything because I stopped seeing people as people," he would tell them. "Don't make the same mistake I did." The changes spread beyond Atlanta. Police departments across the country requested copies of the new training materials. The young woman's organization worked with law enforcement agencies nationwide, helping them implement similar reforms. What had started as a local incident was having national impact. Community meetings, once sparsely attended, now drew crowds. People felt more comfortable speaking up, sharing their experiences and concerns. Police officers attended these meetings not just to listen, but to participate in genuine dialogue. The wall of silence that had often existed between law enforcement and the community began to crack. At the Blue Room, things had changed too. The club worked with the police department to create better protocols for handling situations with patrons. The bouncer who had been there that night became an advocate for improved communication between nightlife establishments and law enforcement. Judge Wilson watched these developments with quiet satisfaction. Though he had recused himself from the legal proceedings, his daughter's handling of the situation had made him prouder than any legal victory ever could. "She turned a moment of injustice into a movement for justice," he told a colleague. The Internal Affairs Department implemented new oversight procedures. Officers with multiple complaints, even minor ones, now faced earlier intervention. "We can't wait until something big happens," the new IA director explained. "We need to catch these issues early and address them properly." Local businesses near the Blue Room noticed changes too. The atmosphere on weekend nights felt different. There was still security, still a police presence, but the approach was more measured, more professional. Officers took time to talk with people, to understand situations before acting. A year after the incident, the young woman stood at a podium in City Hall, addressing a graduation ceremony for new police officers. "Your badge is not just a symbol of authority," she told them. "It's a symbol of trust. Every interaction you have with the public is a chance to build that trust or break it." In the audience, faces both old and new listened intently. There were veteran officers who had lived through the changes, new recruits who had learned from them, and community members who had helped shape them. The incident that could have torn the city apart had instead brought it together. The final report on the incident, now required reading at police academies nationwide, concluded with a simple but powerful message. Real change comes not from the policies we write, but from the lessons we learn. Every crisis carries the seed of transformation. It's what we do with that opportunity that matters.